Welcome to our first District 3 Town Hall. I'm here at Peace of Mind Compton, and I'm so happy that everyone is here. We'll be recording this and posting it later on a YouTube channel. My role as a council member is to engage the community and be a bridge into City Hall. I want to make it clear that I'm a resident first. I live here, and like many of you, I feel a huge disconnect to our local leadership. So fostering an environment of collaboration and learning is important to me. Hosting a monthly town hall is a great way to be transparent. That being said, I don't have all the answers, but I'm excellent at utilizing my resources around me. I will always work to make decisions in the best interest of the residents. So I reached out to Brandon Mims, who is running for city treasurer. He worked in City Hall as a deputy city controller, and he has an extensive background in finance. I knew he would have answers to some of the more complex money issues, and my background is more on the leadership logistics side, so I'm a little more task oriented. Brandon will be taking us through some numbers, and then we'll talk about some of the recommendations reported in the audit. Um, I, want to thank everybody again for coming out, and I'm going to give the floor over to Brandon. Go for it.
Thanks, Jen. First, let me just thank you for reaching out to me to work with you on this project. I think it's a great idea for council persons to be reaching out to residents in this manner to help them understand what's happening inside of City Hall. The bridge that you mentioned is critical for residents to understand how the policy making process affects their lives and what they can do to have better outcomes and improve the quality of life in their neighborhood. So I think this is a very important town hall. I'm excited about being the presenter. I should mention, that this document is definitely available widely. So this is no secret. A lot of the numbers we'll be going through tonight. But I think what it does represent is an opportunity for residents who'd like to get more involved with the city's finances. Just a quick peek into, what is happening in the city. So Jen, if it's all right with you, I think I'd like to, if you can see my screen, I think I'd just like to start here, basically with the auditors, the firm that conducted the audit, just their general statement about the audit. I think it provides good background on what's happening, what their responsibility is, and then what process they took in auditing the city. So some of the more critical points that have been pronounced over the last weeks about the audit, are essentially summarized right here in this section. When we talk about the allocation of cash to various funds not being properly reconciled, and not being able to obtain sufficient evidence about the allocation of cash between funds. These are critical indicators of loss of controls. And so as the auditor is going through the process, they're looking for flags like this. When we reach out to staff in the city, can they support costs? Is there evidence for allocation of how these costs are being essentially charged to the different funds in the city? It's critical that we talk about general accepted accounting principles for residents. It's sort of an easy word to Google and get quick summaries about what it means and how you can kind of quickly apply it. Obviously, you want to go more in depth, you have that opportunity. But when we're talking about GAAP, these are essentially accepted standards for how accounting should happen. And so when you're looking at that, an auditor will apply those standards to how the city has been practicing its accounting and come up with various determinations, right? Okay, and so this section summarizes some of those. Here we say, right, we were unable to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence about the carrying amount of the city's capital assets. No costs in the second clause here, no costs were capitalized in depreciation expense was not recorded for the year ending June 30th, 2019. Okay, so these are large numbers because, of course, they're related to the city's capital assets. But what's important about this section for residents is just ensuring that we're holding our policymakers accountable for putting policies in place that will prevent this from happening again. Right. Under this third bullet, it talks about additional property and essentially successor agency operations where, again, there was not enough evidence or sufficient records to support the costs. And so, again, what's important about that for residents is just ensuring that we don't want to get into these situations again. When reading an audit, any audit, not just the city's audit, the auditor is going to provide a type of an opinion, and so in the city's audit, there's a qualified opinion. Largely, the emphasis of matters here, the $103 million deficit in the general fund. Well, I'm sorry, a negative position of 113 million, and then 16.4 in the general fund, and then 17 other funds totaling 34.9 million. And I think it's again been pronounced over the last weeks that the city has put in place some measures to manage, how funds are accounted for. But again, it's important for residents that policies are in place, and for council persons and hopeful council persons to have policies in place that would prevent the city from, being able to go this far into the negative again. And as we're going through this, because a lot of this is summarizing. If you have any questions, feel free to, jump out, let me know. So in an audit, there's always going to be essentially schedules of, and statements and financials. These can get pretty complex, but, you want to try and read them as best you can, like your own personal finances. And I know that sounds weird, but anytime you see parentheses, those are negative numbers, right? Of course, these double lines down here are bottom line numbers for these activities. Going through an audit line by line can be tedious, and it takes some commitment. But if you go through the audit, what you'll find, essentially it bears out what has been summarized above in the auditor's statement. So I think perhaps, Jen, it might be good, since this is largely a lot of, numbers that would take probably several sessions for us to go through. Maybe we can jump through some of the concerns that you mentioned when you kind of reached out to me when we were initially discussing this town hall.
Yeah. So if you scroll down to kind of the recommendations that the city, that the auditors found, I think the first thing I want to point out, Brandon, if you can scroll to like that legend right there, is the MW, the material weakness, the significant deficiencies, the best practices, and the non-compliance. I definitely want to celebrate wins and, look at the good things that we're doing, but I only found one best practice in the entire audit. All of the other areas either were MW or non-compliance. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple that stood out to me. One is the petty cash fund, which is on page 176. And I know, it's the city controller's, responsibility, but just as a council person or the next treasurer, I wanted to talk a little bit about those things because there is $13,453 that is unaccounted for in the petty cash fund.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty much detailed here pretty good, which audits tend to do. I think the city's response here that we'll continue to research the difference in petty cash is essentially what we would have to do. So upgrading the cash policy again is, I think, where it'd be important for a council person and also the residents to get involved to make sure that those things happen. So we can see that that planned implementation date there is June 30th, 2021 of this year. So there's an opportunity for us to meet this goal of essentially upgrading the policy and then also recovering that $13,000. I think like you said, your concern is where would $13,000 go, right? Or how do you not account for $13,000? Yeah. Well, 13, it'd be difficult for me to comment specifically on what was happening in this case, but, as controls loosen in any environment, right, there's an opportunity for, someone to essentially not account for something appropriately. And so petty cash can happen as a result of payments in and out, right? And someone should be balancing what their change was, or petty cash could be a set amount that a department is given and is supposed to return that amount with receipts. So, however the policy goes forward, what you want to eliminate essentially is this issue. It's identified as a condition because, as you stated, it is.
So the next thing were the capital assets. I know we talked a little bit about this before and the tax increment and all of, this this fun stuff, but it looks like the city was not able to provide information on what assets we had in total. And I want to make sure that I'm kind of reading that right.
Okay.
It's
Which
page 37.
page 37.
Yes. So page 37 and 38, one is capital assets and one talks about the land held for resale, which they also seems like we don't have records for.
Right. And so without defending the city too much here, during this time, yeah, it was difficult for cities and redevelopment agencies and, to be winding down various properties. I think this next one is more related to that, perhaps. Yeah. And so, again, this could be a result of property that transferred from redevelopment agency to the city, which in that case, yeah, there are lots of redevelopment agencies were having difficulties, tracking what properties were actually owned by redevelopment agencies, which was sort of part of the policy issue with redevelopment agencies. Land held for resale definitely identified as a material weakness. Yeah, I could see it being related to that. We'd have to actually probably look more into this finding just to kind of make sure that that's what that was. But then, of course, up here, when the city says it concurs with the recommendation as it relates to the capital assets, these are internal control, essentially guidelines. And so you can see it here. Well, sorry. You can see the OMB. I don't know. Can you see my mouse on your screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the OMB uniform guidance, right? So that's going to be more of an internal control issue, right? So where you are going to have to develop a policy and make sure that that is implemented upon those.
So in regards to policies, Mercedes had a question. She said, will the controller's office present new policies and who approves them?
Yeah, so the city controller will work with the city manager to develop these policies, and ultimately the city council would adopt them. The city controller reports to the council as well. I think, there's an opportunity for, the city council to probably work directly with the city controller on some specific concerns that they may have. But definitely, I could see this happening with the city manager, the city controller, um, and of course, in the future, as it relates to cash controls, right? Then perhaps the city treasurer.
Got it. So then I would say that as a city council member and working closely with them, I mean, as a leader, it would be our job to make sure that the controller and the city manager are working on these things regularly to bring us back up into, you know, um, back to a good place, right?
Yeah, you want to see items coming before the council that stem from the recommendations in the audit. Uh, so you'd want to see a policy that was related to petty cash, right, coming forward. And you'd want to make sure that it essentially complied with what the recommendations were here. It seems easy, it sounds easier actually when you are in the public administrative structure, right, trying to get these things done. It can be a little difficult because it can require some systemic change, right? What is happening with petty cash and how it's managed could be something that the city manager, city controller, city treasurer, and department heads all need to get involved in and work out over some period of time to ensure, um, in some cases, and this is not specific to the city, but in some cases where audits make recommendations for structural changes, right? Those changes will happen in a budget adjustment or maybe in a new budget year even. And so it may take that time to get to that point. Um, but as far as just monitoring it, right? I agree. Yeah, that's where the council and residents are going to be, very important in making sure all this happens.
Got it. The next one I wanted to talk about was the negative fund balances. It's on page 47. Um, I know it sounds like a lot of this is just operational issues. Um, but I definitely want to talk about it because it says that, with revenue shortfalls and there could be, you know, um, unanticipated expenditures. So I wanted you to kind of explain that one because I think that this one sounds the most scary to me. So yeah,
Okay, no, which page?
page 47. So negative fund balances.
Oh, negative fund. Oh, well, negative fund balances. Yeah. Anytime negative and fund and balance are not good, right? Okay. Okay. So let's just see what it's saying here. Yeah. Now, uh, fund balances, right? So the idea of a fund balance in public budgeting, right? So, you're going to run a department and in Department X, it's funded with 5 different funding sources, perhaps. And let's say that each of them make up 20% of that department's budget. And you can go forward for a year in that department. And if one of those funds is a grant fund, it's likely that you're going to request reimbursement for that money at some point. So during that fiscal year, you want to make sure that you're doing everything in compliance with that grant funding so that you're not negative 20% of your budget, because the money that's going out of the door every day to pay your staff or to do your operation is general fund, right? So you're getting the general fund back on a reimbursement basis. So a great way, unfortunately, to get into a negative fund balance situation, if you will, is to have costs that you believe you're allocating to some special revenue that it doesn't actually qualify for, right? So, then another thing is accounting, right? Charges to that go off are charged to funds that they shouldn't be, essentially. And so, as you accumulate all those costs in those charges, then you can have a negative fund balance. You can perhaps in an organization that is, has fund budgeting, you could have a fund that owes another fund money, right? So you have been covering the costs of some fund because that fund doesn't have the money, right? So some programs can experience that when they get budget cuts. So then the general fund has to kick in. You have the option of running a deficit, running that as a, I guess, as a deficit. You can accrue that, right, and total that negative and say that that negative belongs to that fund, or you can just wipe it into the general fund because that's what's happening anyway. And so then as you have different accounting methods and different perhaps management coming in, changing the way things happen, those charges get lost, right? So that's unfortunately another way that you can have a negative fund balance situation. So I think the recommendation there obviously is what you want to do. You want to try to make changes to not increase these negatives in these, and so, but if you can think, say you've been paying a particular fund or for a particular fund for several years, you may not have the ability cash wise, right, to, the accounting is one thing, right, because the numbers on paper are just that, but then the cash that is available to back up that fund, right? And so if you get in a situation where a fund can't afford to pay back another fund in real life in cash, then that's an even different situation, because accounting of numbers is different than the cash, which of course is banked. So this is definitely important. I think, I'm sure that the city will make all of these corrective actions by June 30th, 2021, because I've heard that the new city controller actually is great and working on a lot of things to improve, how these conditions in the city. So that's a great thing.
Yes, I heard good things about her also. Um, so I am gonna put us a little bit on the spot
Okay.
with with page 52 and the procurement request for proposals documentation. Um, and for me as a resident, I feel like this one is probably one of the more important ones, because it seems like we don't have kind of a good standard operating manual for contracts and other items kind of that we pay for. So 10 out of the 15 contracts tested did not have the request for proposals. And I know for a lot of cities, like with the company that I work for, we submit bids and we have to do, all the right things. And it looks like we may not be doing that.
Well, in an audit, what's happening is the auditor is sampling, several thousands of transactions. And what you don't want to happen is for a majority of those sampled to have an issue, right? You don't want the auditor to observe an issue. And so, because then they make a generalization that this must be occurring throughout. So this is what you have happening here. So, that's just a sort of a explanation of that. Now, flipping out of the world of, what we obviously see as a deficiency here, what can be done is, more training essentially at all of the levels where purchasing is are made, right? So if the policy is $7,500 or if it's some other number, what can frequently happen is, a vendor, before you know it as a staff person, right, can reach a point where they have maybe they've done $7,500 worth of work, right? So, outside of the context of, what's happening in the city, and even in other organizations, it's very difficult to control, without really staunch systems. how contractors, sometimes can get procured. So I think that, it's a concern. That's definitely why it's outlined here. When I was working in the city, right, as the deputy city controller, I know that we worked a lot with departments on why this was important, right? Why and how it would help us get through the audit. So I'm sure that this, is, even though it's observed here, this is definitely something that I know is being worked on, constantly. Um, but I think, as a council person, as a resident, you want to make sure that this June 30th, 2021 date down here, that, between now and then that you would see something that essentially address this, or if not, perhaps a date when something would, right? Because I know that not everything can get done at the same time, right?
Right. It was a lot of information in the audit and a lot of areas that needed to be corrected. But on that note, as you stated, I haven't heard anything in the last couple of meetings about, some sort of timeline and kind of where we are with the audit. I don't know if you have. I do know that they are working on it, but as a resident, I think it's important that we have some sort of transparency and kind of a table of where we are with those things. um,
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I can agree. You know, I think my perspective is definitely one that, having worked in the city for 7 years and just, understanding how bureaucracy can be. Um, Audits like these, they're a hard hit because everyone gets them. Like we're talking about it right now. It's a piece of like public. It's a piece of public record, I guess, if you will, where anyone can kind of, grab onto it. But the actual inner workings and the teams that it takes and the commitment, ongoing, these are things that, as policymakers, perhaps, right, when you get in, that you want to make sure that that commitment is there, right? Even if something is not happening on the council agenda, right? You want to make sure that the commitment to do these things is happening in City Hall. So but I know that this one is, yeah, definitely on your on your radar. I can understand why, as a resident, you want to make sure that the public dollars are being spent, in the most competitive way, and that's essentially what these types of policies want to do. Right? They want to make sure that you're not just giving a contract to someone that just because. Um, and in many instances, that isn't the case. It's just, there's a breakdown of, some other policy or training, that has created an instance where, you know, you have this, essentially where there weren't these RFPs. Like you said, in your job, you guys kind of do it as a course of, making sure that you get the right price for things, and so this is just about, making sure that this is built in to the process.
right. So I know you wanted to touch on some of these recommendations. Also, I don't know if you had any specific ones.
Yeah, I had, what we got here. Obviously, right? I gotta talk about the treasurer. Um, okay. No, I think that's not where I wanted to go. So essentially, while I'm finding it here, I said talk about the treasurer's office, but it isn't necessarily about that, but it is the control. So one of the campaign issues or platforms that I've been on, if you will, is this idea that all the cash that comes into City Hall, when I become the city treasurer, all the cash that comes into the City Hall will remain in City Hall. And there is a finding that's related to, what happened with cash in City Hall. The employee that, actually took cash from City Hall. And I guess without even going into much detail about the finding, I do want to make it clear that, one of the important breakdowns there was the cash controls and with the cash receipting process, right? And so,
Brandon, I'm sorry. It's page 161, I think is what you're looking for.
okay, thank you. Sorry. It's like a massive document.
Yes, it took me 3 days to get through all of it. So
Okay, so we'll be able to look at it here. Okay, sorry about this. Just taking a few seconds to scroll here. 167.
161, you passed it.
Okay, so this material control here. One of the issues that we found, and as you go through this finding, the issue with the daily receipting, and so what we found without the reconciliations and identifying working with the internal auditor at that time that was in the city controller's office. The reconciliation process, it not being completed, had allowed the city to fall into a place where cash receipting wasn't essentially being, the difference in the cash receipting wasn't being caught. And so in this, I just wanted to highlight here the importance of having strong policies in place for training, for what should happen, in the case of fraud, and just simple things like controls in offices, right? Um, as you go through this, you'll find that the employee that was taking the cash was actually taking the cash in a backpack, right? And so in instances like that, a simple, no backpack or someone there to verify, what the amounts were, and then a second person, and then even a third person, to verify what the cash was that was going to the bank. Those types of processes in that office, could have, help resolve that issue. One of the recommendations here, as you can see, is even though the city has implemented several new procedures, there's no read-only process for monitoring the bank activity. And this is critical because in this way, you would, as the city treasurer, be able to look into the city controller's records. And then as the city controller, be able to look into the city treasurer's records with a read access only, right? But in that way, you can verify that the cash that's going from the bank is the cash that is being accounted for, on a daily basis. And so I'm encouraged by the city's, essentially agreements to work in the direction to have this. But that's definitely one of the things that I wanted to mention in this, town hall, because until that system is in place, we're still kind of, at risk, of something potentially happening again, where, just because we weren't able to look into those systems, we didn't catch some variants.
Brandon, do you know what new procedures they have implemented in the treasurer's office?
I've been I'm aware of some cameras that were installed in the office. I know at one point there was some controversy about whether cameras could be installed in the office. Um, I know for me, once that much cash had been taken from the office, I definitely would have no issue, with having cameras, because that's a security measure, that needs to be in place to help protect the residents' money. Um, Outside of the cameras, and I don't see anything here that is mentioned. I'm not aware of, essentially, I'm definitely not aware of a system, where the treasurer could look into the controller's records and the controller could look into the treasurer's records, which I think ultimately is what is needed to solve that disconnect.
Got it.
It's important, to highlight some of the changes even that we started while I was there, the segregation of roles in the treasurer's office, making sure that the same person wasn't doing, the entire process of cash receipting. Because what was happening, and I guess it could be important for the residents to understand, since I was there, working on this and trying to determine and quantify what the amount of theft was. What was actually happening is, essentially an employee was submitting one cash receipt, to the bank and another to the city controller's office. And so in order to kind of understand what and how the theft was occurring, we had to go into the methodology of what was happening with the cash receipts, look back several years, even engage a forensic auditor to come in, and dig deeper into records. So, this is a very important finding, obviously, but, for the residents, and I think, definitely as a council person, right, we would want to make sure that by this planned implementation date, that there was something that addressed this. And, I will say again, it's encouraging to hear that things are in place, and so we just want to make sure that we complete the mission there.
So, first of all, he was stealing money for several years, which is kind of mind-boggling to steal that much money, and it not be um, noticed, I guess is a good word for it. But I guess my question for you is, as someone running for city treasurer and having $4 million walk out of the office back in 2017, to still have material weaknesses, even now, and needing to implement things. I mean, I feel like this is something that should have already happened. So I guess in talking about, things taking a little bit of time, cameras, yeah, that's a good first step, but it's been several years since this happened. And that's really, things that are partially implemented and things like that. So as a treasurer, what do you think you would do differently?
Right. So as the city treasurer, we would have obviously the segregation of duties, which should have, has been in place, but we would have the segregation of duties emphasize on multiple layers of accountability in the office. So the reconciliation process that happens in the controller's office is a banking process. The cash receipting process obviously is a cash process that needs to be controlled better and on an ongoing basis monitored for quality. And so that happens in the city treasurer's office. I think, one of the most important things is to make sure that all staff are trained and that everyone is able to have some opportunity, well, that people feel that there are accountability levels for the work that they do in the office. One of the issues, that with this particular theft was that, like a lot of trust, I think, had been placed in a particular employee. And so, as time goes on, it's easy to get comfortable, but you want to rotate positions. You don't want someone sitting at that desk, being able to work in that desk for, more than say 6 months, maybe a year. So you want to rotate staff, make sure that other folks are getting to review their processes, right? So what are you doing on your desk, right? So because that's an easy way to catch variances, have other staff work, cross train. Finally, I think the most important thing is that the treasurer be there in the office as much as possible to be the signature on the cash that goes to the bank. So as the elected, city treasurer, I feel like it is my duty to put my name on the document to verify the cash that is going to the bank. And so if I'm doing it, then I'm going to guarantee, then I am ensuring in the public trust that I have put the systems in place to verify that this is the amount of cash that was collected in the city treasurer's office for this day. And then as I'm signing my name, I know that I've put in place these various levels of accountability, rotating folks, and then just making sure that people understand my presence in the office is about accountability, right? So you got to be there in the office. I think be there at the end of the day, to, as much as possible. I mean, to be the signature on the line for the cash that goes to the bank. It's an accountability thing at the end of the day. Is how you take the commitment that you make to the residents when you take the oath, when you run for office.
No, I totally agree with you. Were there any other areas that you wanted to discuss?
No, I think by way of a town hall, we have a lot of information.
I agree. There is one though, last thing, before we go and we close, and it is the recommendation of an audit committee. Um, you know, it talks in there about, creating an audit committee that is not associated with City Hall, and who has, competent people who understand finances. How do you feel about that? And is that something that is, somewhat easy to implement, once we take office?
So, I think the idea of a finance committee that reviews essentially adherence, compliance to policy is a great idea. Um, I think, as is mentioned in the audit, this type of oversight is just going to increase again, unfortunately, back to accountability, right? So this type of committee is going to require that transparency that will ultimately lead to the accountability that will eliminate, these findings. And so definitely, as the city treasurer, what I do is engage residents on a one-on-one basis, like I like to do anyway. But then also, I'd like to have a monthly public forum where I'm addressing residents on essentially what the status of, or what my status is, essentially to adhering to many of these findings, where they are applicable to the treasurer's office, right? And so by that way, I think that would be a good way to kind of develop a interest group, sort of get some public drive around the idea of paying attention to the audit, paying attention to finances, and then perhaps after a while of doing that type of session, then perhaps pull people from that group, right? That have been consistent, that have some good understanding based on the things we've been talking about. Pull those people, perhaps have them at the resident level, not necessarily some blessed committee by the city council, but just residents that want to stay informed, and then work with them, to make sure that we get the word out about what's happening, to improve, right, the city's finances.
Perfect. So, with that, I will close us out. I know that was a lot of information. So you can find the audit on my website, which is floresforcouncil.com. But you can find it on the city's website, also. I know this was a lot, and I know it sounds bad, but I think it's the first step, in understanding the issues in order to correct them. I think that for me, along with the audit and, community feedback from District 3, this will kind of be my guide throughout my first term, right? One of my goals is to work with City Council to create a strategic plan. And I think the audit is kind of something that we can use as a roadmap into doing that. Um, I look at all of the issues like safety and our, fixing our streets and things like that as mosaics, right? Like pictures, but it's made out of all these different pieces. So I think working towards financial solvency and, creating procedures that make sense, is part of that mosaic and that bigger picture. So I want to thank Brandon for coming on. I know it was a big, it's a big document. So thank you. And I will just leave you with this, as residents, I know that we feel disconnected to leadership. And I know that it can be a little bit defeating, but I think the call to action is to stay engaged, talk to your neighbors, vote. We have to have leadership that's effective and that will listen and really engage with the residents. And I don't believe Compton is a lost cause. I love this city, and I think that we can get us back on the right track. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you out there.